Guten Morgen und guten Tag, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, friends and partners, listeners, and in particular, dear Nina Jankowicz and lieber Lutz Güllner. My name is David Gill. I'm the German Consul General in New York, and I would like to welcome you to the kickoff of a series of talks over the next months, highlighting a constantly growing and serious challenge for societies all over the world. I'm impressed by the great interest these talks under the headline Dealing with Disinformation generates. That definitely speaks for the timeliness of the topic as well of course, for the excellence of our distinguished speakers. Indeed, we must concede that there is much to discuss. The spread of disinformation through new forms of communication has become a serious threat to our free democratic society. In modern social media and messenger services, disinformation, often less information than pure manipulation by enemies of free societies, functions like a poison that weakens democracy. Disinformation has a sustained destabilizing effect, and it is proven that even influences the outcome of elections, the cornerstone of democracy. We witness with great concern here in the United States, as well as in Germany and other countries, how individuals or political parties with illegitimate interests benefit by circulating disinformation. Worldwide, we see how scrupulously even states use this tool for their propaganda and to destabilize societies, like Russia and its war of aggression against Ukraine. We have to develop solutions to improve resilience against these attacks on freedom and democracy. And we have to provide people with the right knowledge and tools to not only detect disinformation, but also successfully to denounce it. I'm very thankful that the American Council on Germany was open to approach this topic and this series with us at the Consulate General. It is of high importance that diplomacy and civil society work together when it comes to the core issue of our free society. And our American, German, and transatlantic partnership is a suitable framework for doing that. It is my pleasure now to kick off this exciting conversation with Nina Jankowicz, Lutz Güllner, and all of you. And I also want to thank Steve Sokol, ACG's president, for moderating this event.
Herzlichen Dank, David. Many thanks, David. We are also equally delighted to be collaborating with you and your colleagues at the German Consulate in New York for this virtual series. I'm looking forward to today's discussion, but also to the discussions that we have in the pipeline. So once again, herzlichen Dank. I'm also very delighted to welcome as well our two guests, Nina Jankowicz and Lutz Güllner, as our experts for this very first event in this series. Nina is Vice President at the Center for Information Resilience and previously served as the head of the Disinformation Governance Board of the US Department of Homeland Security. Nina, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us. And Lutz is the head of Strategic Communications and Information Analysis at the European External Action Service, and he's based in Brussels. Herzlich willkommen. So
nice to be here.
Thank you. Nina and Lutz, you've both been working on the issue of disinformation and how to combat disinformation for many years. And to set the stage, I thought it would be really interesting to talk a little bit about some of the trends and some of the developments that you've seen over the last 5 to 10 years when it comes to the threats that are posed by disinformation, because I think there's been certainly a growing awareness, but also a change in terms of the kind of threat that's being posed. And most specifically, I'm interested in sort of unpacking with you how much has changed over time? Lutz, I thought maybe we could start with you and sort of get your lay of the land, and then Nina, we'll come to you.
Great. So first of all, thank you very much to you, Stephen, and of course the American Council in Germany and the Consulate General. Really very, very important subject that is with us and will remain with us. That's pretty clear. And maybe just a couple of points to answer your question. Number one, it's of course the whole issue of disinformation and information manipulation is not a very new activity, something that we have seen over decades, over maybe even centuries. But what is really the new element in there is the way this is done, is the digital means, the digital instruments in there. And of course, our digital media and digital media platforms play an important role in all this, but it's not only a problem of social media, let's call it like this. It is the broader media system that we need to look at. And that is brings me to my first point of one of these trends, because sometimes we perceive disinformation as a problem of communication. Communication is certainly an important element there, also in our responses and how to react and how to debunk and how to pre-bunk. I think everybody in this discussion is familiar with these terms. But my point is communication is only one of the many elements that we need to put in place. And we also need to understand this issue in a broader context. It's not about somebody putting out just a narrative and placing it there. And that is maybe the first trend that I would see. It's not about just voicing kind of a specific narrative. These campaigns that are behind this narrative are very sophisticated. Very often they use different techniques, not only in the information space, but also beyond, very often combined with cyber attacks and other elements. And we need to understand that this is, as I said, not just a communication activity. This is something which is broader, and that requires kind of also broader answers. Some people call it multifaceted problem and multifaceted answers. Second trend is what used to be, some people called it the wholesale campaigns, a couple of years ago. So big campaigns, very visible. You could easily trace them to specific actors, to specific sources. Well, that has changed a little bit. We see much more sophisticated, interlinked kind of activities using different sets of networks that have been created on different social media. So not the big campaign on Facebook or the big campaign on what used to be Twitter or something like this, but smaller campaigns that are interlinked, but they are as efficient and very difficult to detect. That's maybe the second trend. And the third trend, not to forget, this is not just an activity of state actors. That's a little bit what my team is looking at. This is, of course, a societal issue as well. But the key issue here is that it's not the narrative in itself, which is the indicator that we should look at. Of course, it's the most visible element, and of course, we cannot ignore it. But what concerns me most is how do actually these actors produce these narratives? How do they spread them? What techniques are they using? What behavior is behind? And I think the Peace Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa put this very, very in a very good picture, in a very good metaphor. She said the content that we see is like the projectile, it's like the bullet. That's what hurts. That is what we see. But we need to understand that this projectile comes out of a weapon. Somebody has built something somewhere. So that is, I think, the understanding that is so important. If we just run behind narratives, we will always be in the defensive. We will always be behind the curve. And we need to look at the broader ecosystem. Mm-hmm. I stop here because I know Nina has also many, many points to share on this.
No, that's great, Lutz. Thank you for starting with that. Nina, I saw you nodding your head a lot as Lutz was talking, and so I'm sure that there's a lot there that you agree with, probably not anything that you disagree with, but I'd love to hear you sort of round out some of the things that Lutz has shared with us.
Yeah, so I'll try my best to find some points of disagreement during our conversation, or else it'll be quite boring. But I do agree with Lutz's kind of general view there. I think there's a couple things to point out. You know, Lutz was talking a lot about we can't just focus on the narrative. And I think that's something that a lot of people misunderstand about the broad work of countering disinformation. People think it's about removing things from the internet or proving them false. And that's just not true, because the most successful disinformation, and this was true even in 2016, so this is something that stayed the same rather than something that has changed. The most successful disinformation isn't stuff that is cut or dry falsehood. It's things that have a kernel of truth to them and often are playing on real, authentic emotions that vulnerable audiences that they're targeting have. So that might be racial tensions. It might be about hot button issues like abortion or gun rights here in the United States. Those things are the things that the hostile states are playing on. And they're the things that the domestic actors who are quite clever in the way that they use disinformation are playing on as well. They do that for power and for profit. The things that have changed, I think in general, the way that we conceive of disinformation, again, has stayed the same. And also the tools and tactics that most people think about when they think of disinformation, they think it's still the same as it was in 2016, where we're talking about trolls and bots and massive inauthentic behavior campaigns. That's just not the case anymore. And I very rarely give credit to the social media platforms, but I will do it in this case. It's because they have put a lot of, until recently, put a lot of spending power and thought behind detecting these campaigns and taking them down. So where we had the Internet Research Agency, the famous St. Petersburg troll factory, creating massive inauthentic behavior campaigns in 2016 through 2018, that's much, much more difficult. And we see social media platforms taking them down more effectively and much more quickly than they used to. What that means, though, is that there's still room for manipulation in a much more difficult area to respond to. And this is what I call information laundering. This is when a malign foreign actor will launder a narrative, again, usually with a kernel of truth to it, to an authentic local voice. And that might be an influencer. It might be a politician who has some things in common with that hostile state actor. And they say, look what we have for you. It could be a piece of malinformation that is like a hack and leak. It could be a story that seems incredible to you or I, but could be credible to that particular politician or influencer and their audience. And they say, here's some information for you. Take that and do with it what you will. And that might be a post on social media. It might be airing it on mainstream media when they're doing interviews. It might be introducing legislation about it. And we've seen all cases of all three of those things. And that makes it much more difficult to respond to, right? Because we do protect freedom of expression. We're not going to say to this person, you're not allowed to speak anymore. That's just not how we operate in democratic societies. It might be how they operate in Russia, but it's not how we operate in the West. And so what do you do in that case? And that's when we get to pre-bunking. That's when we get to kind of these strategic communications campaigns that need to push back against these narratives. And it becomes much, much more complex because often you're on the back foot. What I will say, my final point is that pre-bunking and general kind of awareness raising campaigns have been shown to work and very effectively function, especially in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine and the lead up to it, frankly. We saw the United States and the UK declassify intelligence ahead of that full-scale invasion so that people would be less likely to buy into Russia's narratives relating to false flag attacks and other disinformation that they planned to spread. And I saw that in real time in my work at CIR, the Center for Information Resilience. In the lead up to February 24th, 2022, we were getting our Eyes on Russia project started. And if you're interested in this, you can check it out on eyesonrussia.org. What this project does at the time, we were tracking Russian military maneuvers closer and closer to Ukraine, the movement of battalions and equipment and things like that closer to the border, in some case crossing the border. Now we look at human rights abuses and attacks on civilian infrastructure and all of this stuff, and we geolocate it and chronolocate it, and we're able to say, using that footage, mostly from social media that's open source, we're able to prove Russia wrong in many instances. And in one instance, right before the invasion, after that declassification of intelligence, which you could refer to as pre-bunking, we were able to look at a so-called car bombing that Russia was making a lot of noise about. They said, oh, Ukraine bombed this civilian vehicle in eastern Ukraine. look at how horrible it is. And we were able to prove not only that this car bombing had not come from Ukraine, that it was a device that had been planted in a car, that the car had been moved there, and that the car was equipped, you might say, or stacked with cadavers. So they had taken bodies from a morgue that were already dead, that had had postmortems performed on them. And we were able to zoom into the footage and kind of see the marks on bones, quite grisly, that showed that, and prove that wrong. And I think that was a really shining example, and there have been many since then, that proves that pre-bunking works and that civil society is often able to take that communication slack from government, where it might be a little bit less trusted coming from government. We're able to pick that up and say to the civilian population, this is just not true. Look at how ludicrous this narrative coming from Russia or Iran or China is. So that's kind of a picture of how things have shifted, both for the good and the bad in the past, I would say, 8 to 10 years.
I mean, this is really fascinating, and you've both put a lot on the table, and I'd like to maybe just pick up on a couple of the threads and dig a little bit deeper. One thing that you said specifically, Nina, but Lutz, that you were alluding to as well, has to do with the fact that not everything that consists of disinformation is 100% disinformation, right? That notion of a kernel of truth being in there. And certainly we've gone through phases where there's been a lot of concern around fake news, around alternative facts. If something is out and out fake or out and out disinformation, it is obviously easier to debunk. But with something where there's that kernel of truth, or where there are some elements of the truth associated with it, or a different interpretation of agreed upon facts, it makes it a little bit harder to counter that. What are each of your thoughts on how to address sort of that issue? Because that I could imagine is incredibly difficult. How does one parse the reality from the disinformation?
Well, if I can kick off, Nina, on this one, it's the core of the matter in our business, if I can call it like that, even if we're here more a government side from my side and Nina more a civil society perspective, because that is the problem. Who gives you the right to judge what is true, what is not true, in particular if we come to the world of opinions, for example, you know? And I think, therefore, I made this plea in the very beginning. Let's be very careful in having good narratives and bad narratives, to put them in boxes of black and white, of good and bad, etc. I mean, there are some cases which are pretty obvious of invented lies, etc., where you can prove the things also with forensic kind of methods that Nina just explained. But the real issue is techniques like amplification of, let's say, legitimate voices in a very polarized debate, for example, that is being used as one of the techniques, you know, because either to give this one voice a much bigger volume and visibility than it would usually have, or to stoke conflict also, you know. I think what Nina was alluding to a moment ago was that we saw campaigns in the past, the voices on both sides of the extreme, so with different opinions, have been amplified. Why? Not because there was a message, not because there was a narrative, but because the aim of the exercise was to stoke this debate, this division, etc., and undermining kind of let's say a more civilized debate. So our approach to this is to distinguish 3 elements. And that's what we call the ABC model, you know. A stands for actor, B stands for behavior, and C stands for content. So the content is, of course, important. But if we don't see how this content has been developed, who has been pushing this, if we cannot deduct from looking at these behaviors, at the tactics, the techniques, at the procedures being used, if we cannot deduct the intention behind, then we will never be kind of out of this dilemma in saying what is allowed to be said and what is not allowed to be said. So it's a very good indicator, this behavioral element. And then, of course, the actor, you know, the moment we can attribute it, the moment we know where it comes from, then we can also deduct. This is not a genuine opinion. This is not a point of view of somebody who would like to voice this, but this is part of a broader exercise. So I think we need to disentangle these elements. It sounds terribly academic now, the way I describe it, but it's easier to explain that if you have a debate, look at Europe, for example, where we have a very let's say, emotional debate about migration, for example, all the points of views on migration are absolutely legitimate. The people who are against it, who are in favor of it, I don't know, whatever, this is part of our democratic debate. But if an outside actor then comes in and starts to reinforce artificially and amplify artificially specific voices, gives them a broader megaphone, let's say, that's where the red line is. And this is also how we should approach it. And that's why I prefer the term information manipulation to disinformation. Disinformation looks as if the content needs to be falsified, verifiably false. We have worked with this in the past, but I think it's time to look at the techniques behind in this. So the behavioral element, which is really important. And last thought on this: if you can show kind of what techniques are being used, just raise awareness. And I can give you also a couple of examples. There has been a recent campaign which is called the Doppelganger. It has a wonderful German name, the Doppelganger campaign. So the cloning of websites of reputable media like The Guardian, Le Monde, that have been cloned in a way that a layperson will not be able to distinguish what is the real website and what is the fake website. And then they have changed kind of the content in the fake website in a way that it exactly gave this kind of little bit other point of view that would usually not have been printed. It's this type of thing. You need to raise awareness for this for these techniques.
Thank you. Nina, do you want to add anything to that about sort of the kernel of truth issue and this notion of information manipulation? Or would you like to pick up on the other topic that I wanted to raise with the two of you out of your opening remarks, which had to do with this sort of domestic versus foreign actor piece of it, right? We are definitely, and one of our viewers actually posed a question about this, asking if you could show some of the connections between foreign actors and locals. I think, Nina, you had talked about malign foreign actors often trying to find an authentic local voice. That's obviously part of it. But I would also think that we are dealing with challenges both on the domestic level in the United States, certainly in Germany and across the EU, but also where there are foreign actors who are acting against us nationally, and that we have to distinguish between these two levels of threat.
Yeah, so I think both of those questions are tied together by adding context. And so much of the disinformation that we see that really does well in our kind of current information environment is because it's lacking context. So whether that's the behavior or the actor, like Lutz was talking about, or whether it's a broader connection between a foreign actor and a domestic actor, or whether whatever actor it is understands that if we strip a quote or an event or a photo of its context, that it can be manipulated in all sorts of ways. And also, again, if we obstruct the actor and the behavior that they're related to, those tools, tactics, and procedures, as we call them in the industry, then it's much more difficult for kind of your average person to differentiate. And so one of the things that I believe is, even after a lot of really disconcerting events that I've had to deal with myself over the past couple of years, I still really believe in information literacy. And if we educate people, and I really think this actually needs to be older adults, not necessarily Gen Z who are internet natives, right? If we educate people about how information makes its way around the internet now, the algorithms that prioritize certain information over others, the ways that malign actors are able to manipulate the tools at their disposal, to use Maria Ressa's metaphor that Lutz mentioned before, the gun, right? What is the gun in this situation? It's social media. Then I think people will start to take those ideas into account a little bit more. They'll understand, okay, on TikTok, I'm being fed information that I'm interacting with. What video have I recently interacted with that would lead me to be fed anti-vaccine content, or something that's going to make me quite emotional about gun rights or something like that? All of that really helps. And so I think, again, there's a lot of focus and kind of a misunderstanding in the general community about the fact that disinformation has to be about fact checking or deciding what's true or false, and that's just not true. And it's quite ironic, actually, because a lot of people believed that I was going to be a minister of truth and censor people, and that's nothing that has anything to do with what my research has been about. I believe in arming people with more information so that they can make decisions for themselves. I think that gets around the problem of, the slippery slope between domestic and foreign actors and labeling things as fake or true or somewhere in between. We need to help people navigate the increasingly complex context that information is presented to them in today's internet age.
So you've both talked a little bit about sort of the trend of things becoming far more sophisticated when it comes to these kinds of campaigns, and not just looking at the narrative, but looking at all of the parts that go into these campaigns. And I wonder, and one of our viewers actually posed a question about this, but I wonder what role social media and messenger services play in spreading disinformation, and what can be done about that, and by whom. That's the other thing. Media literacy, information literacy, that's part of it, right? Being able to parse what you read and add the context if the context is missing. But that's probably not enough.
Yeah, so I've been looking at messenger services and closed platforms for the better part of, almost 5 years now, as we saw social media platforms turning more on the more overt disinformation that we saw in 2016 and 2017, and squashing some of that. Bad actors have moved to messenger services and closed groups. And what these platforms, let's call them, have to their advantage is that there's a higher degree of trust in closed Facebook groups and WhatsApp kind of broadcast groups or Telegram channels, things like that, because you're there because of a specific interest. So one interesting kind of personal aside that I experienced recently before the birth of my son was I was joining a lot of pregnancy groups and things like that. And there's a ton of disinformation there, particularly, targeting women in the most vulnerable period of their life rather. And it's often kind of cross-referenced with vaccine doubting or relations to, what's the word I'm looking for? Like more crunchy medicine, not kind of the more natural, homeopathic, that sort of thing. And so you can see how vulnerable groupings of people then might be led to take content there that is more, it's appealing to a sense of uncertainty that they have in their lives. And we saw this a lot in the pandemic as well. Now there's kind of been a little bit of a move away from Facebook groups. I think me and a couple of my colleagues have made enough noise about Facebook groups that there's a little bit more attention being paid to them, and people are moving off to alternative platforms, whether those are platforms that are more free speech oriented and don't have as much content moderation, although interestingly often have content moderation for things they don't like on there. And platforms like WhatsApp and Telegram, where there's just no content moderation at all. And what we've seen that has worked a little bit, so Meta has introduced, I think in particular response to disinformation in Brazil around their elections, several cycles of them. WhatsApp is huge in Brazil, and people were forwarding a lot of disinformation to groups there and broadcast channels. And so they've introduced a limit on forwarding. So you can only forward a message 5 times, which stops it to an extent. But if you think about what that graph looks like, right? If we each forward a message to 5 people and they forward it to 5 people and they forward it to 5 people, that can still get a lot of legs. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, there isn't a way to report, particularly on Telegram, where we see a lot of the most extreme content and hateful content. So what you have there is a real blind spot. And the CIR does a lot of monitoring of hateful groups on Telegram and disinformation that's spreading in those groups. And essentially, especially for secret Telegram channels, you either have to be approved to be added, or you have to know about them ahead of time. They're unlisted. You can't identify them. And that proves as a real difficulty for researchers and policymakers, because there's a lot of conversation happening there that is private. And I'm not arguing against privacy, right? But it means that we are losing a sense of the most viral and potentially most damaging conversations happening that could have a real effect on public safety and public health. And so I think what we need there, this is where regulation comes in, and we've seen some of this introduced in the EU through the DSA. I think it needs to be introduced more broadly, but transparency, data transparency from the social media platforms to researchers, civil society organizations, journalists. Right now, the only time that we can get our hands on that data is if we infiltrate a group, or sometimes on platforms like Facebook and now Twitter, we essentially go against the terms of service on the platform to gather that data in order to understand what's going on there. So that's one possibility. Or when we have a whistleblower like Frances Haugen or some of her colleagues who have come out and brought that data out with them. So we have a very skewed picture, I think the social media platforms would argue, of what's going on in those platforms, but we need the data. I think if they're going to make that argument, they need to kind of give up the goods in a way that we can have oversight over privacy, make sure that it's not getting leaked anywhere, but also that we understand what's going on. If this is really the democratic town square of the future, there needs to be some sort of understanding of what's being talked about and the ways that it's impacting public safety.
I mean, that sort of leads to a somewhat more philosophical question that one of our viewers posed, which is how can one limit disinformation, but then also ensure freedom of speech and freedom of opinion at the same time? Lutz, you smiled. Nina, you're nodding. I don't know who wants to try to tackle that first.
Well, I think the key point is it will be futile to limit disinformation or to stop disinformation. It will be out there all the time. I sometimes use a bit of quirky picture. My colleagues get always very nervous when I do this. It's like in a supermarket, you know. If people want to get bad stuff, they will find it in the supermarket. If they look for it, they will get it, you know. The point is really that we need to find a way to protect those people who don't want to have junk stuff, you know, who don't want to be targeted by this, that they are not manipulated, that they are not pushed in a direction where they shouldn't go. And we need to empower these people. We need to help them. I mean, the key word here is resilience, but resilience is not enough. I think this is a bit the approach. And I've been laughing a little bit because sometimes, you know, people ask me, so how can we stop Russian disinformation? I mean, if you try to stop it, you need to totally control your own information environment. And we don't want this. We're an open society. We're a liberal society. We want people to voice their opinions. We want the discussions in the society, but we don't want them to be manipulated from outside. I think this is really where the difference is. And very often I get the question, so if you fight disinformation, in inverted commas, so if you address the issue, isn't it automatically that you limit freedom of expression? And I would like to turn this around. Actually, we, in that case, as a governmental actor or organizations like Nina's, for example, actually, we do one thing, and that is we help freedom of speech because it is not impacted, you know, by factors that actually kind of give you a wrong picture that certain voices are louder than they are. And let's not forget, the manipulation is not just on the level of the content, you know, as I said already. Sorry that I really need to hammer this point home. This manipulation is happening also on identities. How many people are speaking that are not real people? And I'm not only talking about bots and trolls. I'm also talking about persona that have been created for nothing else but to have a broader impact, you know. Or journalists that are no journalists, or information portals that are no information portals. And these are the issues that we need to address. And that is, of course, in an open society is a very tricky issue, and nobody takes this lightly. But with a good mix of policies and with a good cooperation, what we call the all of society approach, where civil society, journalists, the broad public, and governmental actors play all their role hand in hand, I think this is the way forward we need to go.
Yeah. Sorry, Nina, were you going to add in?
Well, I just would say what I said before about where we need to equip people with the tools that they need to navigate today's information environment. And that has nothing to do with removing content online. In fact, in my first book, this one over here, How to Lose the Information War, I call that playing whack-a-troll. A lot of our response then and now, and the way that people conceive of the fight against disinformation, thinks they believe that that's about removing or demoting certain speech online. And it just isn't true. If the social media platforms find something that goes against their terms of service, it's in their rights to remove it. They are private platforms. But in terms of public responses, I am all about putting good information out there and teaching people how to discover it, not about removing it. I think playing whack-a-troll is a losing battle, particularly when we're talking about malign foreign actors that have no scruples in terms of democratic principles like freedom of expression. We don't want to be like them.
So in light of what each of you have said, and in light of what we've been talking about in terms of sort of more sophisticated tools, I'm sure that both of you have been thinking a lot about the role that artificial intelligence can play when it comes to this threat and this challenge, and particularly something like ChatGPT. One of our viewers asked, in this world where we're inundated with information, how is it possible to distinguish between something that's been produced by artificial intelligence and something that's real?
Well, we're not quite there yet, particularly on the text side. So because I tend to go down these rabbit holes as a disinformation researcher, the other day I created a little task for myself to try to get ChatGPT 3.5, which has specific kind of roadblocks around creating disinformation campaigns about real people and real events, to give me a disinformation campaign. And it only took about 5 minutes of manipulating to be able to get around those roadblocks. I started with saying something like, okay, write something about Hillary Clinton being corrupt. And it was like, I don't comment on political events. Okay, great. Write something about Daenerys Targaryen being a corrupt leader. Daenerys Targaryen from Game of Thrones, obviously. And then it was happy to create fan fiction. And then I said, okay, what about introducing these specific characters and an upcoming election to, Westeros, blah, blah, blah. It's very easy to get it to do that. And then you do a quick find and replace. It creates, 20 posts for you, and you can easily put them out online. And the thing that really worries me about that is many of the indicators that we use to identify disinformation, foreign disinformation, targeting other societies before were linguistic indicators, and ChatGPT is very good at writing in crystal clear, grammatically perfect English or Polish or German. And so I think that is a democratized version of the troll factory that we now have, and it's going to be much more successful in identifying those fissures in our society that can be manipulated, and B, using and mimicking the tone of voice that people that are vulnerable in that space use. But that's one hand, that's the text-based side of things. There's also an image-based side, and that's where things are a little bit farther ahead, thankfully. So there's an initiative called the Content Authenticity Initiative that's run by Adobe, which makes Photoshop and a number of other softwares that are used to create deepfakes, among other kind of artistic endeavors. And they've paired up with a bunch of civil society and media organizations in order to create basically a badge that would be placed on images and video that have been edited using their software that shows whether that content is authentic or not, or it can kind of take you through the different versions of an edit that has happened to a photo. So you can tell, okay, has this been created out of thin air, or is it something that actually came from real life? I think with images, it's a lot easier than with the closed text-based platforms. I think this also goes back to media literacy, understanding what's available to just regular users who don't have technical expertise in terms of understanding where something came from, the provenance of something. So everyone should know how to run a basic Google image search, reverse image search on their machine. There are other platforms that are a bit more powerful than Google, and you can look them up. But essentially, what a reverse image search allows you to do is identify the first or one of the first instances of an image online. And so often we see with natural disasters, the misattribution of images to new events. And so we actually see this in Ukraine a lot too. Russia will try to pose photos from the Kosovo conflict as current photos of Ukraine. And so if you do a reverse image search on that, it'll take you back and say, oh, actually, this is from Kosovo in the 90s. That's really helpful. We don't have that capability for videos yet on a large scale, but I'm sure that that will be coming soon. And then for text, really, all you have to do is take a bit of text and drop it into Google. You copy and paste it, and it will return if that is something that has been pasted around the internet through an inauthentic campaign, if it's kind of a version of today's chainmail, or if it's something that's come from a legitimate news outlet that you should respect. And I think that that is one of the most efficient ways for a regular person to take 2 seconds after they read something online and see where it's come from. I have a lot of hesitations about AI. I think that it has huge implications for human rights abuses around the world, and removal of freedom of opinion and expression and freedom to information. However, I don't think it is quite as doom and gloom as everyone thinks it is. You still can trust what you see online. You still can trust what you read. You just need to take a few extra steps to make sure that you're looking at something that is trustworthy. And
as one of our viewers pointed out in the chat, how important it is. This underscores sort of how important it is that one consume multiple sources of information, right? That you're not just in your cocoon and sort of just taking information that you want to take in, but that you're looking at different media sources and reading different newspapers and thinking about those different sources and adding that context that you talked about earlier.
I wanted to add something, and I actually wanted to offer a bit of a disagreement between Nina and myself, but she nuanced it in the end, so that's not a disagreement anymore. So I wouldn't see at the moment that AI is kind of the doom and gloom, it's the end of our communications, because everything will be manipulated in whatever way. For the time being, and I'm a little bit cautious because, of course, these things might change. But for the time being, these generative AI models, instruments that we have are still tools that are being used. So they make it easier, they make it faster, but there is still an intention behind. There is still an actor behind. There's still somebody who's using this stuff, So it still helps us to put it kind of in context. I think a real, let's say, paradigm shift would be reached, and I'm using the conditional, if there was a sort of auto-generative kind of narratives and campaigns. We're not there yet, as far as I know. I might be wrong. And also on the visual and audiovisual side, I would agree with Nina. I mean, maybe AI or what we call as AI, also we need to get away from these kind of very kind of galactic words and have concepts, etc., and really break it down to reality as well. But maybe some of these tools that we have, and that also some of the tech companies are developing, could actually help us also exactly in the way that Nina just mentioned. Let's see. So I think the jury is out there. It is, yes, we should be worried to a certain extent, but it's not the end of what we are reading and how we are communicating.
So let me pick up on that. We should be worried. As you both know, we are looking at some very important elections in the coming years. There's the European parliamentary election next year, the US presidential election next year, elections in Germany the year after that, not to mention state elections and a whole bunch of other elections that are coming up. One of our viewers sort of wanted to start by looking back at the past and wants to know specifically to what degree Russia might have been involved in disinformation campaigns in the 2016 US election and how that might have confused voters to vote for Trump. Nina, do you have a short answer to that? And then I'd like to talk a little bit more about what's on the horizon in the coming year.
Short answer, no, but I'll try to be as brief as possible. I mean, I think it's impossible to kind of do a retroactive review here without understanding A, who exactly was targeted, B, the means through which they were targeted, and C, how they voted. And we're never going to know all three of those things and be able to connect the dots. What I can say is, even putting disinformation itself aside, like let's just leave the IRA and their disinformation campaigns out of there. What Russia was able to do, and do successfully, was change the narrative around the campaigns, plural, both the Clinton and Trump campaign, through WikiLeaks and DC Leaks. The hack and leak operation that was introduced in the very last stages of the campaign in 2016 changed the way the Clinton campaign talked about itself, the way the Trump campaign talked about the Clinton campaign, the way that the media talked about the Clinton campaign. And I think that is a very successful information operation without even introducing any of the manipulated, inauthentic behavior online. So, whether that changed votes or not, we will never know, but I think it certainly changed the conversation, and you have to think that that might have changed some people's voting behavior.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for that. So looking ahead to particularly 2024, and let's start with the European parliamentary elections. Let's, to what degree have you at the EU level been taking measures regarding the elections? What are you concerned about? And I guess, are national governments adequately prepared for disinformation campaigns that could be disruptive to the elections?
Well, I think we're learning, of course, every elections, every new events, etc. But there is a very important point that I want to make first as a general point on elections. If we assume that our elections will be hacked, will be manipulated, and therefore it's not even worthwhile going to the elections, then the attackers have achieved already their aim, and that is to undermine kind of the democratic legitimacy of this process. So we need to be very, very careful not to fall into the trap of what the experts call perception hacking, just with a few kind of tiny little exercises, all the people get very excited, and there is this opinion out there, these elections have been hacked and it's not legitimate, etc. So let's not blow the problem up, but let's also not belittle it. I think this is lesson number one. Lesson number two is, and also what we are doing here at EU level, is the key word is preparedness. Even if nothing is happening, even if nobody's interfering, which in my view is good news if it was like that, but we need to be ready to have the instruments in place, to have the mechanisms in place that we can react, that we can understand what is happening. Some of these things are technical in the sense of knowing how to distinguish or how to identify such an attack, if you want to use the word attack. There can be technical means, there can be kind of these a bit more monitoring type exercise. We need to do a lot of education also inside the system. So what are really risks in there? We are doing this in the European Union with elections networks, also between election officials, etc. Has a lot of different levels, not everything is related to disinformation and information manipulation. There are, of course, also cyber risks and many other things, very, very technical things. And the core for me is really that we need to learn every time of these techniques, of the risks, of the new methods, that we don't stand at the moment of the elections there and don't know what it is that we are seeing. I think this is really, really the core. But again, I come back to my first point. I would really not like to have this conversation that the next elections will be manipulated, they will be attacked, there will be so much kind of interference that we cannot trust our own elections anymore, because it would be very, very dangerous and would be exactly what the attackers want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, and obviously with a view to our election, Nina, I'm very curious to hear what you have to say in terms of concerns about attacks, but also, how do we make sure that the attackers don't win and that our elections are still seen as being legitimate?
Yeah, so this is something I've been worried about for a long time. I have worked throughout my career in parts of the world where elections, because of the kind of legacy of the Soviet Union in the early Soviet period and even the late Soviet period or late democratic period, you might say, people don't trust the votes are going to be counted. And that is a generational harm that is hard to shake off. And what I worry about, because we still have politicians in the United States who claim that the elections in 2020 were stolen, I really worry about people's trust in the democratic process. And that's not something that Russia did, right? That's something that came from within. However, it does make us more vulnerable. Our polarization makes us more vulnerable to outside influence and manipulation. What I'm really worried about as we head toward 2024 is the attacks on both researchers and government entities who have been working to oversee and shed light on information manipulation, not only during election season, but throughout time. I always say that inflections are not an end point, they're an inflection point. And so what's been happening for those that might not be as steeped in this and as I am is to give kind of the Cliff Notes version. I had been appointed to a role in the Biden administration in 2022 that was at the Department of Homeland Security that was meant to coordinate what DHS was doing with regard to counter disinformation activities. Certain political actors in the United States, as I mentioned and alluded to before, said that this was going to be a censorship organization with absolutely no basis in fact. As a result, I was subject to a lot of harassment and threats while I was weeks away from giving birth to my first child. And I ended up resigning that role because the government wasn't really supporting me and kind of had put the kibosh on that effort, which I think was a big mistake. It said and signaled to these bad actors who were telling lies about what we were doing that this was something that could be successful. And that opened the door to a whole raft of attacks on similar initiatives across the research space at Stanford University, at the University of Washington, the Atlantic Council here in DC, and a number of other researchers have since been hit with similar attacks just for doing work on countering disinformation. There have also been inquiries into government efforts, some of which are legitimate and I think raise legitimate questions, but are, again, steeped in this absolutely contextless narrative that the government is out there to censor people, and they're not. And because of all this, because of this increased pressure, which takes an enormous personal toll on individual researchers and institutions who are answering FOIA requests, but are also now afraid to go outside of their houses because they've been doxxed or, threatened, as I have, there is a greater cost to doing this work. And what I worry about is that these systems that have been created over the past 8 years as we head toward 2024, in the wake of 2016, all these systems are now under a huge amount of stress. And it is because of those systems that we know about the attacks that Iran tried to launch in 2020 during our elections, which targeted voters in key swing states and tried to keep them away from the polls. It's because of these instances that we know that Russian journalists were attempting to, or Russian influencers were attempting to get American journalists on their payroll and write stories that would hasten polarization in the United States. This is one of the things that I'm most worried about, and that government employees don't have the support that they need to withstand these attacks and continue doing the work that is going to protect our national security and our democratic process. I'm sorry to be so doom and gloom about it, but I think it is. I'm not worried about Russia. I'm worried about forces within that are taking down legitimate work that is being done, research that's being done, advice that's being given, and frankly, the functioning and national security of civil servants in their own jobs.
And that's, thank you for that. And thank you for your openness. I mean, that's part of the reason why earlier in our conversation, I also really wanted to try to distinguish a little bit between internal actors and some of those external actors and the external threats. Obviously, when it comes to those internal threats, the situation is very different from country to country, but we're seeing some similar trends in different places. We've talked about a lot of things, and we're coming to an end here. This has been a fascinating and wide-ranging conversation. I want to come back to sort of what we can do, and despite some of the doom and gloom, maybe try to end on a positive note, or at least provide some sort of an outlook. We've talked a little bit about media literacy and just information literacy, and I think that's an important component to it. Lutz, you've commented several times that when it comes to disinformation, there's no silver bullet, right? I think if we knew what the single response was or action that could be taken, it would be very easy. Maybe as we wrap up, if I could get a closing comment from each of you on what measures do you think we need to try to implement, either at a multilateral level, like through the work that you're doing at the EU, or on a national level, or even as an individual? And is there low-hanging fruit? Are there a couple of easy fixes that you see that are within grasp that we're just not implementing yet?
So I'll try to be quick because you've heard a lot from me. I mean, I think we all need to invest more in information literacy. I think everyone needs to take a personal responsibility for the information that they share online. But I also hope to see more oversight legislation being passed in countries and multilateral institutions around the world so that we can better understand what is going on the internet and have it not be hearsay and have this, ridiculous politicized conversation about what is or is not happening online. There are scientists who can figure that out, right? And we just need to have a clearinghouse of that information so that that can pass from platforms to researchers. And then we have a better understanding so governments can make policy with real data in hand. I think that will make a real difference. It is not a quick fix, but I think it needs to happen sooner rather than later.
My answer is slightly longer, but because that is exactly what we have been designing here. I think we need to put in place 4 broad building blocks at the same time. And that makes it very difficult in policy ways because that goes in different areas and parts. So number 1 is what we call situational awareness. We need to continue investing in the way to understand what is happening and tracking and tracing and analyzing in the work that Nina and many others have been doing and much more. Because if we don't know what the problem is and how it looks like, we cannot even deal with this. And that is part of where we need to distinguish what is really dangerous and what is not dangerous. What is really a problem, what is not a problem. What is free speech and what is not free speech, this type of thing. I mean, big question. So that's the first block. The second block is, we mentioned it, resilience. Resilience in the society. It's a lot of different things. Even just enumerating them would be a long discussion about fact-checking initiatives, journalism activities, media literacy activities. And you see, they go in very different fields: education, strengthening of civil society, etc. Of course, also the communications part, whatever, about putting out there kind of good sources, trustworthiness kind of initiatives, etc. The third pillar is regulation. I mean, there is regulation, and we didn't speak about this. Of course, many of the audience here knows that we have adopted in the European Union a specific law, the Digital Services Act, with a few additional kind of elements, the code of practice, which has 2 main ideas, and that is transparency and accountability of those that play a really important role in this, and that is the social media companies. I actually believe we also need to think about other regulatory policies, looking at what media regulators think about these websites that look like information portals, but they are no information portals, etc. But this is maybe a little bit more complicated. And the last one is the international field. The international cooperation. It's not just a problem in one country, in one continent. It's something that we see globally. And I think that can have very soft elements of working together and understanding the problem, that can have very sharp elements like sanctions, imposing costs on disinformation actors, like we have done also in the European Union now in the context of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and the use of RT, for example, and not because we sanctions because we didn't like what the one or the other journalist is saying, but because RT is an instrument of the Russian state, nothing else but that. It's not a media outlet in that sense. Anyway, a longer discussion for which we don't have time. And lastly, because this is also sponsored by the German Consulate in New York, there is also a level of, let's think about international norms in this field. Is it okay if one country actually builds a troll farm, with a mere kind of aim of attacking another country? Is this okay in international relations? It's not. And we have no norm on this one. So I would be a strong supporter of thinking about what are basic rules for responsible state behavior in this field. We are not very far in this debate, and we had a similar one on cyber. It's complicated, but I think it's worthwhile to have this conversation.
Well, my deep thanks to both of you. Many, many thanks to Lutz Güllner and to Nina Jankowicz. Thank you to our viewers for the many questions. I was able to include some of them, but not all of them, but keep those questions coming. And certainly a big thanks to our partners at the German Consulate here in New York for collaborating on this series. I certainly hope that our viewers can join us for the next installment of Dealing with Disinformation, because exactly the issues that Lutz was talking about at the end of his comments just now about the global context are the issues that we'll be talking about on October 12th, when we'll be hosting a conversation about disinformation in the area of international affairs with Ralf Beste, the head of communications and culture in the German Foreign Office, and Melissa Fleming, the Undersecretary General for Global Communications at the United Nations. So I hope our viewers will be able to tune in. And for the two of you, Nina and Lutz, perhaps you'll tune in or watch the recording after the fact, because they might be saying some things that are interesting to each of you and your work. But this has been incredibly insightful, and I just want to thank both of you again for making the time to be with us today.
Thank you.